As the prophet of esports, I rely on trustworthy and meaningful data every day. Data from our research partner, YouGov, offers the most complete view of esports fans and gamers in the world, providing context to who they are, what they think, the brands they buy, and things they do. YouGov's connected insights and research services inform strategy at every level. If you're a team, a brand, agency, or rights holder, you should be talking with YouGov. Their partners measure and maximize ROI and are telling compelling stories with data. Visit yougov.com/gaming-esports to learn more. I want to talk about a story that is totally relevant because we had them on the podcast, but I thought from a business standpoint, interesting sort of strategic shift here. And I was curious to get sort of everyone's feelings on this. And the headline here is, Immortals relocates headquarters to Great Lakes region, aims to be, and this is the part that struck me, a one of one in attractive, underrepresented region for competitive gaming. We obviously had Jordan Sherman, Ari Siegel from Immortals on the podcast. If you didn't listen to that episode, guys, great episode. Highly recommend you go back and listen to it. But this was the announcement they sort of teased on the podcast, or I think we even discussed it a little bit on the podcast. Jimmy, you were going to say something.
I was just saying we definitely discussed it after the recording.
Oh yeah, I couldn't remember if it made it into the show or if it was after the fact. But it's one of these things where you have an esports, like most esports orgs. Let me just give some context here. Most esports orgs are headquartered basically in LA, in the US at least, and New York to a smaller extent. Some in Texas, obviously, but they're pretty clustered, right? You have esports orgs in major cities typically, whether they're in North America or in Europe. This is a totally different strategic kind of move where they're saying we want to go and be the only esports org in this region, the one of one. And we're going to pick a region that there's nothing else there, but we believe is underrepresented and has a bunch of gamers. And so for them, this is the Detroit metropolitan area. I'm curious, Jeff, do you like this strategy?
I want to hear what other people have to say first, because I'm going back and forth. I'm going back and forth. Like I am.
Lindsay, Lindsay, we can, if you want to wait for Lindsay.
Lindsay start.
This is interesting because we're still early on enough in the industry where you can make these kind of bold moves and have these theses, and it's not immediately discounted. I mean, this is such a cop-out, but it's like, it's a strategy. I don't know if it's the strategy.
That is a cop-out. That is a cop-out.
Time will tell. so I don't know.
Sorry, Lindsay,
No, go
sorry,
ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. What makes sense to me, and this is obviously something that we had talked about, was, when you look at Los Angeles, for example, you got FaZe Clan, you got TSM, right? You used to have Immortals, you have 100 Thieves, and so many, Gen G, all these teams with headquarters there, that if I'm from LA or I'm from California or just the Southwest in general, there's a ton of teams to choose from geographically without regard to talent or what games they play or colors or branding, etc. So what made sense to me was like, yeah, there's esports fans all over the world. And for that new fan, and this is part of that Activision Blizzard kind of Overwatch city branding mentality, but like for that new fan, if I'm just getting into it and there's all these teams to choose from, why wouldn't I root for my hometown the way I do in traditional sports? And so to have your team relocated to an area where you don't have that much competition, where you can attract all those millions of fans and young kids that don't want to root for the LA team or the New York team, I thought that was pretty cool. So, obviously you guys know Jordan's a friend of mine, but I would support this even if he wasn't. I think it's a cool story, and I hope it works out.
The question I have, and this is what I was kind of going back and forth in my head. Are they doing this and they're going to brand the teams Detroit, or is this because they want to get employees from Detroit and they think it's like a up and coming tech hub where they can sort of be the dominant? They're the only game in town, if you will. So like they'll theoretically get the best employees.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul. I thought it was more of the former, because they're actually a fully remote organization now where they're hiring anywhere. So it's more about the branding.
It's more about the fans than the employees.
Yeah.
And I believe that they're branding themselves as the Great Lakes region more so than Detroit. Detroit being one of the spokes of their many,
correct,
of their wheel of fortune, if you want to call it that. Yeah, Jeff, I'm gonna let you finish.
No, I'm still like, it's funny on the podcast. I know they kind of alluded to some interesting, maybe like zigging when other people were zagging, which I respect and I like. My take is kind of a little bit similar to Lindsay's, where it's like, it's a strategy. I don't know that it's the right strategy. Like, I feel like we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about, talking bad about some of the leagues that have city-based. I know that's not a verb or a word, but that have gone that way, because it's like, well, esports is global. The whole beauty of esports is you don't have to be city-based. You can have this global brand, this global media base and franchise. And I guess they're kind of planting their flag in the entire Midwest, which is like, a decent or Great Lakes region, which is not just one city. But to me, I don't know. Like, to me, it feels like they're running away from maybe like what is a bigger piece of competition, and going kind of hyper local, which could work. Like, to be fair, it could get them a really sort of niche, loyal fan base. But like, to me, this limits the greater potential of being a global media brand.
So I love the insight. I see a natural segue here, and I'm curious, Paul, if you have the NV Optic merger queued up for today, because I just see a lot of parallels, which are great counterpoints, I think, to issues you just brought up, but also just something to compare and contrast with, in terms of dominating that region, merging, potentially running away from competition by merging with others. I don't know. There's a lot of similarities here that I want to talk about, if you guys are ready to include that in the conversation.
Yeah, I do want to say something quick before we head over to just, I think there's a couple of other examples we can look at for some sort of reference as to the move that's happening here, right? Immortals, formerly an LA-based organization. I think going hyper-local, as Jeff was mentioning, another organization you can look at is the Susquehanna Sonics, right? Based out of Susquehanna, super small, local. They tried the same thing. Inevitably, that team ended up picking international rosters, dropping the Susquehanna and just going with the Sonics, finding 100x more success. That's one case of it working for them. Other teams have gone hyper local and it's worked for them too. Chili Mountain is very, very, very specific to New York, and they're finding success in the New York community. So it's working for them. It's working for these other organizations. Anbox, they tie themselves to New York and it works as well. So, I think it brings up a good point in that, like, you can hyper localize, but the localization has to be attractive. You know what I mean? There has to be something to the localization aspect to it. You localize in New York, you're in New York. You localize in the Great Lakes region, you're in the Great Lakes region. Let's make that area attractive. And so I think things like Belong Arenas and in creating more incentives for the Midwest is setting up a good arc for a lot of companies' future success in esports and gaming in the Midwest. But as it stands now, I can't say I have a lot of faith in it. But 5-10 years from now, as we're seeing the infrastructure built out, I can see a long-term strategy working out for them in terms of what they're looking at.
Before we move on, Paul, if I could just make one more. I think, Jimmy, you kind of more eloquently said maybe what I meant to say. Like, I don't think, I'm not trying to, my comment wasn't to say like, oh, wow, I think this is a bad strategy, it's going to fail. I think it does limit them, though, right? Like, they can be successful in that kind of big fish, small pond way, but I think it probably limits them from a bigger perspective. And I do worry, I know Paul's head's going to explode when I say this, but using the authenticity word, it's like, you're an LA-based franchise, like, is there any lore to why they're moving? Like, I would just love to understand how they're going to execute on this rebrand and what they're going to do to activate the local communities. Cause it's like, they're sort of just like moving the team, plopping it down and being like, well, we're now the Great Lakes. Like, one, I feel like a lot of people in the Great Lakes, like people in Detroit hate people in Chicago. So it's like having one esports team that's like, oh, like, I'm a Detroit fan. No, you're a Great Lakes fan. Like, I'm not sure if the people in the region like view themselves that way. So like, I guess I'm curious to see how the execution is. And I don't know enough. I don't want to be very critical, because I think, having listened to the podcast, I know, Jordan and Ari are incredibly sharp and like have this is a very well thought out strategy. So I'm excited from a business perspective to see how it plays out. But that's just kind of my thoughts.
Yeah. Big picture, I like the contrarian strategies in general, right? Like I like when people are going in a different direction from what everyone else is doing. And the reality is it's either going to be spectacularly right or spectacularly wrong, right? Like when you play that contrarian strategy, the outcome tends to be very binary. I think where I agree with it is I never understood why every big esports org has to be in LA, right? Like that never made a whole ton of sense for me. You're in a market that's incredibly expensive. I
agree. But at the same time, like if it was Detroit, like at least Detroit strong, there's something to it, like New York, you're bold, like whatever it is, like Florida, you're kind of crazy in the head.
The reality though, is that everything city-based, while in principle and on paper sounds like it should work, right? Like people have affinity to the city they live in. And so you automatically sort of get fans just because people live in that city. That has sort of not proven out in esports, right? I would argue Anbox failed massively, does not own New York at all, and their org has not done well at all. I would argue the city-based leagues for Activision Blizzard have not done well, and whether that's because of the city-based structure, we can debate that. It's probably not all that. It's definitely not all that. And then even things like G2, right? G2 said they were going to come and own New York. That never happened. Everyone who has sort of tried this has failed or has stalled or has not proven that this hyper local business model can work. I think what, and Jeff, you alluded to this, I think in one of your answers, where I love this though, and I think it's genius, is just in the fight for talent. Why be in an environment like LA where you're competing against 10 other esports orgs for content creators, editors, videographers, talent, like you name it, right? In every category, there's this massive competition for gaming talent. When you could be the cool team in Detroit or in the Great Lakes region, have all the talent to yourself. From a business perspective, I think it's genius. I love it, right? And it's a reason why Canada has a great sort of startup environment, because it's way less competitive than San Francisco, right? If you're going to go do a tech startup. And so I like the idea from a business and people perspective. I think the jury's still out on, can they corner the fan base there and monetize the local fan base effectively enough to build a great esports org? Remains to be seen. I think if anyone can do it, they can, though.